Now, central banks in Brazil, India and other emerging nations are all stuck on hold, with rising inflation limiting their options as energy prices have rebounded and emerging market currencies have weakened. And our guest says this is causing a divergence in inflation dynamics between advanced and emerging economies. Let's discuss now with Caroline Grady, Macro Hive economist and former senior emerging markets economist at Deutsche Bank. Very good to have you with us, Caroline. So what is it that these emerging markets have in common at this point? We can talk about the differences and put them in the same basket when we talk about inflation.
Sure. Well, we've been looking at the pockets of inflationary pressures that are starting to appear across emerging markets. And it's not uniform, but there's quite a few countries. It's Mexico, it's India, it's Russia, Poland to some extent, and you have still high inflation in Turkey. And this has been a sort of pronounced uptrend over the past several months. And the reasons for this is the recovery in energy prices that we've seen, still elevated food price inflation, and the pass-through from earlier FX weakness, if you think back to the big moves in sort of March and going into Q2. And also we have ongoing supply bottlenecks in these countries. So they're the key factors pushing up inflation in the emerging market space.
Yeah, I guess the time horizon must be important here when we talk about what's driving inflation, Caroline, because if I think about oil prices, they fell incredibly from the highs pre-pandemic and then went negative. And yes, they've rebounded, but we're still only at $40 or so. So is that really the driver for emerging markets, or is it other factors?
I mean, food is the bigger driver than energy, and also because the food price weight in emerging market inflation baskets is much higher generally than it is in advanced economies. I mean, in India, you're talking 46% on food prices. In Mexico, it's more like 23%, but if you compare that to the euro area, you're somewhere around sort of 14%. So this rise in food prices has been a very big factor. I think more
so it's the food price story, food price story then we really need to watch. What about policy response then? Of course, if inflation is on the rise and your economy is struggling, this makes things difficult for any central bank. What course have you seen central banks taking through this? We've seen many central banks just deciding to stay on hold. Is that the most likely course of action?
Yeah, I mean, as you said, we've had several on hold this week. We had Brazil on hold after 9 consecutive rate cuts. We had South Africa on hold, whereas it was expected they would cut rates again. India in August was on hold. And I think one of the key issues for central banks right now is there's a lot of uncertainty around the inflation outlook. I mean, the Mexican central bank said very explicitly the balance of risk to inflation was uncertain. And that's a really unusual environment to be in. And so because of that, these central banks will be very cautious. They will want to make sure that inflation expectations are anchored. And so even if they think, well, we have these very large output gaps, weak demand will dampen inflation overall, they want to be very certain that that's the case. And you have seen a lot of front loading in rate cuts in emerging markets as well.
Do you think then that central banks in these regions, in these emerging markets, will need to be increasingly creative around policy? Some of them already are, using other levers to try and drive their economies rather than the rather blunt tool that is the interest rate.
I mean, emerging market central banks, they still have room to cut. You're not at the zero lower bound, with a few exceptions. Versus the case in advanced economies. So certainly some of them have moved to QE this year. Poland is one example. But I think for the biggest economies, I mean, I think for now they will stick to interest rates as the main policy tool. But right now, I think you're going to see EM central banks on hold. They will take stock of recent developments and just take a very cautious approach.
Yeah. Caroline, thanks so much. Thanks for joining us. Caroline Grady, Macro Hive economist, 8:37 here in London.